There's this idea that science is about sort of eliminating what's false, not necessarily about finding the truth. So a lot of times when we talk about science, there are these ideas that people want to talk about. They want to say, well, what if this other idea is right? What if you're wrong about this that you're presenting? And so why don't you present the controversy and let people see things both ways? And here you have a number of T-shirt images, not necessarily actually live scientific controversies. The devil bearing dinosaur bones to confuse people, geocentrism, the 5 elements, storks bringing babies. I'm not endorsing these. Don't get me wrong. So before I tell you what I think, does anyone want to tell me what they think makes something a scientific controversy, a legitimate scientific controversy? Okay. You don't have to, but you can. Okay, yes.
Well, I guess I feel like a legitimate scientific controversy isn't really something that I worry about as much as the false scientific controversies that I see my students worrying about. Mm-hmm. So I showed my students a video on TED.com about, it was Michael Pollan, the food journalist, talking about a plant-side view of agriculture, basically. I'm an ag librarian. And I asked my students to take notes, and I saw one student writing down very carefully, believes in evolution. Like, that was the thing that this student got out of this talk there are all kinds of really great ideas about agriculture in the talk.
Right.
And regularly when students watch this video, around a third of them, when they write about or think about Darwinism versus evolution, to me that isn't, I don't want to offend anyone. To me, that's not really a scientific controversy. It's a different kind of controversy. It's legitimate in a different way. But it's not scientific.
But so, in terms of how do we distinguish those two, becomes this important question then, right? Because there are some things that in a science class we do debate about and we do argue over. Like, there are two sides to this, and there are some people who say this and some people who say that, and there are some things where we don't do that. So how do we decide that? And how do we, when we're talking to the public, when we're talking to the press, when we're talking to students, when we're talking to other scientists, how do we decide which is which? So I have my ideas, but if anyone else wants to share a thought on it, that's...
Well, I think when you have your data and it's well done, your experimentation is well, you have all the data there, it's hardcore data. There is room, there is a gray area where you have to interpret the data. And I think data interpretation, so you go and you propose what this data mean. And other people may say, well, it's not quite, I see differently. So you have working models. And with that, I think that's the gray area where you can have schools of people interpreting the same data in different ways. Until new data can come, prove which side it is, and a new gray area is set. And then it goes, I think that's where the good scientific debate is based upon.
So within the sort of the scientific method that Steve was talking about, the idea of sort of rejecting false ideas, if you don't have a basis for rejecting either of two competitive theories, then that can be a legitimate scientific theory.
Pretty much, yeah.
And if you come up with something new that, for a long time, Newtonian physics was uncontroversial, and all of a sudden Einstein comes along, and it's like, oh, there's another way that we can explain this, and now we have to rethink. Now that all of a sudden what was uncontroversial becomes controversial because of new knowledge. There was a hand here.
I was basically saying
All right, anyone else? Yeah?
I find myself addressing climate change often with courses that I teach, and I think that there are absolutely scientific debates. What % of this change is being caused by human-induced release of carbon dioxide and et cetera gases? But we shouldn't be debating, is there climate change? No, I don't think so. I mean, that's not a scientific debate because it's not founded on data and it's not open to interpretation. And so with the creationists, they're not looking for interpretation. They have their answer already. And I think the difference between a scientific controversy is as new data comes in, they reinterpret the data and they change their model.
Well, this is perfect. Now you've given my talk for me, so we can all go to lunch. No. Yeah, so, I mean, this is good. Are there other people who want to this sort of hit a lot of the big topics that I want, but
Well, I guess, all this around bringing up this climate change thing, it comes down to controversy occurs because people have skin in the game, right? If no one's got skin in the game, there's no controversy. Who cares? But we are fundamentally tinkering with somebody's. It could be two scientists, one's hypothesis being fudged with their theory, and there's going to be controversy, or it could be a belief system. And if you're fudging with someone's belief system, then you're going to have controversy. So it's skin in the game, I think.
and then the tricky thing is distinguishing then a scientific controversy from a political controversy or a religious controversy, and that really centrally is about the nature of science. That if the beliefs or the ideas that are being challenged, if they're scientific ideas, if they meet the definitions of science and if they can be tested through scientific methods, then we might consider it a legitimate scientific controversy. But if it's something that's outside that, if it's something about personal values or it's about supernatural beliefs that we can't test in the lab, then maybe it's not a scientific controversy. It may be a controversy, but it's a different sort of thing.
I think you're right. But when you're talking to someone who wants to say that this is science, what I see in, like I'm reading the New York Times or whatever, there was a series on science and religion where they were basically sort of seem like scientists kind of lose their place at the table sometimes when they say that. People are saying, well, that is not a legitimate scientific argument. Therefore, you must be stupid and you don't really understand what a real scientific argument or controversy is. You see what I'm saying? And that's something that I struggle with my students, that I don't want them to feel like I don't want, that will just shut them down.
Right.
I said in this last iteration of this class when I showed this video, I would prefer that you not research the Darwinistic aspects of this video because that's not what we're doing here. And so once, I feel like maybe that was a bad thing, it's not legitimate, okay, fine, it's not legitimate, but how do you get that across to someone without destroying their curiosity or just chasing them out of the room altogether?
And in this context, in the climate change context, talking about the nature of science, here's why this is not a scientific question. It's an interesting question, it's a valid question, it's something we can talk about, but this is a science class and we're going to talk about the scientific issues that he's raising. We can talk about these other things in another way. And one of the things that we, at NCSE, that we talk about sometimes, and this is actually also from James Treffill, who Darlene Cavalier-Smith was talking about this morning with the 18 concepts. So the idea that there are some ideas, pretend that the word frontier isn't up there for the moment. There are some ideas that are really at the core of science. Things like, gravity, right? Like, objects with mass attract each other. Maybe someday someone will come up with some wacky new way of thinking about the universe where that's not true, but for the foreseeable future, that is something that is at the center of modern science. The idea that we should treat that sort of thing as controversial is not productive. Treating that as something that's up in the air and subject to debate in an introductory science class, as opposed to the most an upper level graduate seminar in physics, doesn't really make sense. And then there are other ideas that are at the frontiers of science. They're new things. People are publishing on them. It's interesting. There's conversations going on at conferences and in seminars. Advances are being made. All the questions are not answered. There are important things going on there. But there's at least a nascent consensus that's building up. But there's still, the details are yet to be worked out. And then you have fringe ideas that some of them are not even science. Some of them are going to be pseudoscience. They are sort of pretending to be science, but not accepting when they get falsified. When someone comes up with contrary evidence, well, no, because this other thing. And astrology, that no matter what you do to show that astrology is wrong, someone's going to go, oh, but, well, no, it works because of this other thing, and it's still fine. And so those sorts of ideas may well be actually beyond the fringe, but at least they're not in those sort of the core ideas. And so applying that, how do we, I used this example already, but who here thinks that, where would we place gravity? Is it a controversial idea? Should we present it as a controversy? Who says yes? Who says no? And who's abstaining? Right? So gravity, sure, but you talk to physicists and they'll say, okay, we've got pretty good ideas about why planets go around suns and so forth. But if we take those same equations and we try to apply them to electrons going around the nucleus, it all gets weird. We need a whole new theory so that the equations that work at the macroscopic scale work at the microscopic scale. And one of the ideas they put out there for that is string theory. So is this a controversy? Who says yes? Who says no? A couple of hands going up on no. So, this is, I would say that it probably counts as a there are different, it's probably, I would guess that it's probably right. The details are yet to be worked out. There's a lot of publishing and a lot of work back and forth between scientists to try to figure out the details. Something like string theory, we need the particulars are yet to be worked out. What about alchemy? Controversial? Scientific controversy? Yes? Non-scientific controversy? Okay. Or scientific, uncontroversially unscientific. I don't know how many of you are biologists, so this may be getting into the weeds a little bit, but the idea of group selection or kin selection versus other levels of selection, who knows what I'm talking about when I put that up? Okay, a couple of the people who put their hands up, who says controversial, who says uncontroversial? On the fence, perhaps. It could go either way.
I think it could be controversial, but as a whole.
And then we have evolution, which we've got at least one vote that it's not controversial. Who else says it's not controversial? Who says it's controversial? All right? It's scientifically controversial, at least. Is there a controversy over it in society? And then global warming. Again, the example came up. So there's at least one vote that it's not. Any other votes that it's not scientifically controversial? Few votes that it is controversial scientifically. A lot of abstentions, though. I think that some people are sitting on the answer. So, yeah, I would agree that it's not. The fact that global warming is happening, not controversial. The fact that it's caused by humans, not scientifically controversial. The particulars of what effects it will have, the magnitude of the effect remains to be researched. Yeah.
I just want to say that there's another way to look at this, besides this taxonomy that you've given, that I think is good, which is that gravity and alchemy are the two things that people can physically experience, with their eyes and ears, with experience that they can kind of do in their home or read about, whereas the other things are they're more like Gedanken experiments for the average person. They can't, go and play around with a climate model or, do a, genetics lab necessarily, whereas these other things are things either they've read about, alchemy is something that there's been a protracted experience, in society trying to do, and gravity is something that people have personal experience with. So I think there's the other way of looking at, what's the evidence right in front of you.
Right. Although there are people who've done studies, and there are citizen science projects to look at when plants start blooming in the spring. And people are seeing gardeners, and people are watching bird migrations, people are doing, and you can do surveys of hunters and anglers, and they see it. They see change in they see climate change happening in front of them. So there's an aspect of that that's true that makes it certainly easier to perceive a controversy around some of these things because they're less tangible. So our executive director and our deputy director published this paper in 2003 in Trends in Ecology and Evolution, arguing against this idea of we should teach the controversy. This is a creationist slogan that's become common. They point out that if you look at the education literature, you don't see a lot of references to this, even though advocates of it will say, oh no, this is a very important pedagogical approach. And in the context of teaching the controversy, and this is teaching in the broadest sense, talking at a conference, talking to your friends at a party, chatting with someone in the line at the supermarket, all of those are teaching, right? So how do we decide whether, given that something is perhaps a controversy, although we don't have to grant that, but how do we decide, is this something that's really relevant for this context? How do we decide when it's appropriate to teach the controversy? The first criteria that they argued is it should be of interest to your audience. Anything that you say should be of interest to your audience, right? If it's boring, then they're not going to pay attention anyway, so what are you accomplishing? But it also has to be a primarily scientific controversy. If it's not a scientific controversy, and you present it as, in a science context, as a controversy, if you don't make that distinction to people, it's easy to think, well, people are arguing about climate policy, so therefore climate science is controversial. And that's misleading people about the science and about the politics as well, and confusing the issue. It's important that, and this is partly a measure of whether it's a live scientific controversy, are there roughly equal amounts of information available available to people for both sides? If one side is publishing a lot of stuff from legitimate venues and the other place only has a few self-published books, it maybe is not really a legitimate scientific controversy, right? It may, maybe these are just crazy fringe ideas that will someday move from the fringe to the core, but they're not there yet. It's not a stage where it's a legitimate, comparing a core idea that has a large literature to a fringe idea that doesn't, is not a live scientific controversy either. You want to also have equal quality. Again, self-published books, and anyone can put up a web page, anyone can put up a blog and put their ideas out there. That doesn't mean that they're good ideas. That doesn't mean that they're well supported. So it's important that the quality and competence of the materials and the sources that people are drawing on be roughly comparable. Not identical, but sufficiently similar that it's legitimate to think of it as there being two matched sides. And obviously, anytime you're talking to anybody, hopefully you're making sure that the ideas are understandable. Talking about the origin of life, say, involves, if you want to talk about that in an introductory biology class, that involves, you have to know what life is. You have to know what evolution is. You have to know a lot of biochemistry to understand the work that people are doing in origin of life research. So maybe that's not, even if there is legitimate controversy going on about the particular biochemistry that was going on in the early Earth, to present that as a controversial topic in a ninth grade classroom is maybe not appropriate just because it requires too much background knowledge. Not that it's not a legitimate topic of discussion, but just not the best context. And there should be some level, again, of scientific equivalence between the different sides that you're presenting in this controversy, as measured by the literature, but as measured by perhaps the prominence of and the expertise of the people advocating for each side, all of these issues. So here's a recent example of how this came up. This is a cover story from Nature, one of the most prominent science journals, where they were from last August, and you had two ants fighting here. How standard natural selection explains the evolution of eusociality. Ants have this structure where most ants that you see around are infertile females that gather food and do all of this care for the nest, basically for the benefit of one ant, the queen, who's laying all the eggs, and who's the only individual in that population of the hundreds of thousands of ants in a nest who is actually reproductive. And it's a weird thing. It's the closest we come to absolute altruism in the animal world, where all of these ants are doing, everything that they do is for the benefit of another ant, ultimately. Why should that be the case? And one of the ideas that had dominated for the last 50 years or so was this idea of kin selection. And Edward Wilson is a famous ant biologist. He's done a lot of research on the origin of eusociality, this social structure that ants had. And in August, he and a couple of co-authors published an article saying, we actually think that the evidence for one of these explanations is the idea of kin selection, that the infertile female ants are doing this for the queen because they're very closely genetically related to her because of the way that ants reproduce. We don't need to get into the particulars, but there's so much genetic similarity between the queen and each of the worker ants that by working on behalf of the queen, they're basically doing so much for their own genes that it just works out. It makes the most sense. And they say, well, maybe just standard natural selection, even not incorporating kin selection, is sufficient to explain everything that we're seeing. So they published that, and it was crazy. E.O. Wilson, they talked here about kin selection being the basis of the field of sociobiology. He coined the term. He literally wrote the book. So the fact that he's doing, it was sort of revolutionary that it was made all sorts of headlines among, science nerd types, right? Not necessarily in the wide world, but this last week or the week before, a series of letters was published in Nature. This one signed by 136 co-authors, absolutely rejecting this, saying, they're totally off their rockers to say anything like this. this article, this letter that I'm showing you had 136 co-authors. They say that we believe that Wilson et al.'s arguments are based on a misunderstanding of evolutionary theory and a misrepresentation of the empirical literature. We think that they're totally wrong about this. There were 4 other letters with another 17 authors contributing, saying this is just total nonsense. How could you possibly have published this article in the first place? So, this is why I put the line up about kin selection and group selection. Is this a live scientific controversy? Is it legitimate to bring that up in this context, where I am, as I've done now, to talk about this as a scientific controversy? Who says yes? Who says no? All right. I'm not actually sure, because, I mean, E.O. Wilson is a good guy, and I love him to death, but I'm pretty sure he's wrong. And I think that the fact that you can get 150 other scientists to look at this and say, this is just complete nonsense, tells you a lot about the quality of that idea. And a lot of people looked at this paper and said, if E.O. Wilson wasn't one of the authors, it probably would never have gotten published. I mean, it's just not a terribly good argument. But it was E.O. Wilson, and he's a good guy, and this is his field. I mean, these are his organisms and his ideas. And the fact that he's changing his way of looking at it is noteworthy, certainly. But does that make it, just because that these 3 people, compared to 150 other scientists who bothered to write in, and others have expressed their views other ways. So I don't know if this is a legitimate scientific controversy. There's certainly a matter of imbalance between the number of people taking the different sides of this. So it may be, I would say that it's probably a fringe idea going up against a core idea. Maybe it gets some traction, maybe it becomes a controversy in time, but I'm not sure it's there yet.
Well, I think in this point, so if we go back in time, the Earth as a center of the universe was once also
Sure.
As a minor side of science. So I think that is a controversy, and it may, it's not that I'm taking side. I don't know about this controversy, but I mean, it may.
Right.
So I think it's relevant to raise questions, and that's part. Maybe the relevance of this text is not raising a new model, but rather raising the question. And I think this is also part of the science. We arguments, there are counter arguments, good or bad, but it's still there. And I think all are relevant to progress science.
Sure. And I would just distinguish. There's every reason for them for this article to have been published somewhere, whether it belonged in Nature or in a different journal is a separate question. But it's certainly appropriate there. But there's the teach the controversy strategy that creationists use is to sort of say, well, we haven't actually gotten anything published in the scientific literature, but let's start teaching these ideas in high school. Mm-hmm. And so, which is sort of cutting in line, right? There's weird ideas should get published in the scientific literature. That's where they should start out. And then they should be discussed in graduate seminars. And then they should be discussed in upper-level undergraduate classes. And then, if they're pedagogically appropriate and they're interesting, and if they hang on and they persist, they should be in introductory undergrad classes, and then they get into the textbooks, and then they get into high schools, if they're appropriate. If there are ideas so there's a question of is it live? Is it something that's worth discussing in Nature? Yes. Is it something that I would bring into a classroom and say, well, this is a controversial discussion? Probably not. I don't think it's a controversy for that in that context. So does that distinction make sense that I'm drawing? So another thing that I'll put up as something that is a live controversy in science right now is this idea of evolutionary developmental biology. Or the idea of evo-devo is probably not controversial, but how it's going to play out and what effects it's going to have on the practice of biology. Here you've got different skulls of these different groups, and the colors represent where different genes are being expressed in the developmental process. And what people are realizing is that you can map that out on an evolutionary tree and figure out, by looking at the modern species and where these genes are expressed now and how that affects the shape of the skull, you can look back at fossils from 100 million years ago and figure out when these genes mutated so that these developmental changes would be happening. It's crazy stuff. And as we learn more about how a small change to one gene can have, one gene turning on or off changes how all of these green bones develop, that you see so much more prominently here in the mammals. relative to in lizards, say. That's an important change, and that you can track that and understand that changes how we think about the origins of anatomical novelty and all these things. And there are people who look at this and say that we're heading towards a new evolutionary synthesis, building on what was happening in the 1930s and 40s with the modern synthesis. You've got Craig Venter, who much of what he does could probably be described as controversial in at least some context. Among other things, the Human Genome Project, which was politically controversial but not really scientifically, but synthesizing a bacterium basically from scratch. I don't know whether, I mean, there are certainly controversial aspects to it, and the potential there opens up a lot of interesting biological possibilities and research opportunities for people. You've also got interesting research going on early forms of life, the idea of RNA enzymes that on their own can evolve in solution, that can reproduce themselves and evolve. This is what a lot of people think is probably what the earliest step towards life probably looked like. The fact that we can do this in a lab is pretty interesting. Whether that's actually what the earliest life was like or not is an open question. And there are people who think, yeah, it probably was. And there are people who think, no, it probably, maybe it was, instead of that something that can reproduce itself coming first, maybe you had to have something that could process energy first, and that the genetic process came later. And there are people experimenting with alternative forms of biochemistries. These are nucleotides that instead of having a 5-carbon ring in the DNA, it's a 6-carbon ring. So it's the same idea, and you can use it in the lab. You can make strings of things that are able to reproduce themselves in solution. And so these are asking questions about maybe the earliest life on Earth wasn't based on DNA as we know. Maybe it was based on these 6-carbon or on other biochemistries that we haven't discovered yet. So these, I think, are interesting. There's not a resolution there. There are different points of view. There's interesting stuff. The biochemistry of some of these things may be well beyond what you would talk about with a high school student or even, some undergrads. But these are certainly viable things that are interesting and worth discussing with the right audiences. But what about this idea that Darwin first wrote down in 1837? The idea that life itself can be represented as a tree, as this branching tree process. Is that controversial? Says yes. Couple hands. Who says no? Couple hands. A lot of people sitting on the hands. So this is 1837. Here we are. Just last year, this is a graphic that Steve put together of the modern tree of life as people understand it. And as you can see, we can trace everything as far as the best research that's been done over the last 150 or more years. Darwin was pretty much right about this idea that you can take all living things and trace their evolutionary history back through this branching process to at least a single population of ancestors. The exact nature of what's called the last universal common ancestor gets sort of funny, and that's a topic for another day. But the basic structure of this is not terribly controversial until you get right down to what was going on with that organism. So if that's the case, why do people call evolution controversial? And we have this, here's a bill that's wending its way through the Tennessee legislature right now, which among other things says that the teaching of some scientific subjects, including evolution, can cause controversy, and calling on the State Board of Education and every other level of school administration to encourage students to respond appropriately and respectfully to differences of opinion about controversial issues, such as evolution, again. What sort of a controversy are they talking about there? Is it a scientific controversy, or is it a different sort of controversy? I see a lot of people nodding at different sort of controversies. I'll go with that. And I mean, this is politics, so it's a political controversy. By definition, it's a political controversy. It could be scientific as well. But so how do you decide whether something is a legitimate scientific controversy or not? Well, the first thing to do is check the literature. Things like sites like PubMed, where you can search scientific databases of published papers, or Google Scholar, which lets you do the same thing, and it's a little bit more accessible, it's a little bit more wide-ranging in what it covers. You can look for scientific consensus statements from scientific bodies that that are relevant scientific bodies that have done research in the field. And I'm putting this one in gray because it's not as good, but if you're not a professional scientist and reading the scientific literature is not comfortable, then checking a well-sourced Wikipedia entry, making sure that it has that it's citing the peer-reviewed literature, looking at the talk page that is linked at the top, and making sure that there aren't people that there is a discussion going on, that people are looking at it, and that it has been edited by more than one person, that are there views that are being expressed, that are being shot down? How are people talking about it? You can get a feel from it that way. And you can also get a feel from it from credible science blogs, people, ideally something written by a credentialed expert who's writing about their field. Look at who links to that blog. Are they saying this person is a crank and you shouldn't listen to them? Or are you saying this person is pretty smart and a credible source of information on this? How are people talking about these secondary sources that might tell you? Because whether there's a controversy is not just about, is there a paper that says this, but how do relevant experts think about this idea? And so looking not just, is there one paper in PubMed about this, but are there a bunch of papers about this, and what do those papers say? And if you search for evolution, and then you search for creationism in PubMed, you get hundreds of thousands of hits on evolution, and you get a handful of hits on creationism, and they're all book reviews saying that creationism is nonsense. So is there a legitimate scientific controversy there? No. That's just based on the literature. That's not, you don't have to believe me when I say that. Another thing that can be, another thing that we do is at NCNC we publish this book, Voices for Evolution, that just collects statements from various different societies, including scientific societies. You don't have to read all of these, they'll go by way too fast for that. But hundreds of statements from scientific societies, from civil liberties groups, from educational groups, and from religious groups, saying that evolution is good science, that it belongs in classrooms, that creationism is not good science, it doesn't belong in classrooms. And you can find all of those statements at our website at ncnc.com/voices. And we keep that updated so that there's a book version that you can buy, and that's fine. We'll take it. But all of the statements are available on the website as well, and it can be very useful for showing to your students. If they have a question, students can come in and say, well, my church says that this is wrong, so I can't believe it. Their church may have a statement in there saying that it's fine. And that can be a way to diffuse a non-scientific controversy and get back to the scientific issues that are relevant to you as a teacher in a science classroom. And one thing that's especially relevant here is a statement from the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, one of the largest biology societies, which makes it absolutely clear that evolution is not a controversial theory among scientists, and that introducing false controversy into science classes will ultimately impair science education. This also comes up in the context of journalism. This is an article that Chris Mooney and Matt Nisbet wrote in 2005 in Columbia Journalism Review, pointing out at a time when there was a trial in Pennsylvania, in Kansas, there was debate over science standards, in Ohio, in Georgia, there were these fights over evolution in schools. So they looked at how evolution was covered in the news pages and in opinion pages. What they found is that when science writers were writing about evolution, they covered it as scientists understand it, as an uncontroversial idea, as the fundamental idea of modern biology. But when political reporters or general assignment reporters talked about it, they did so without any real context about evolutionary science, and often that provided a false balance with anti-evolution criticism of evolution in this quest to achieve what they rightly put in quotes as balance. Because, of course, balancing good science with non-science is not really, what sort of balance is that if you're talking about scientific issues? And there's something almost dishonest about presenting non-science as if it were science, or presenting unequal ideas as if they were equals. And the opinion pages were worse. They looked at letters to the editor, they looked at op-eds, and basically found that most of these papers were providing 50-50 coverage on their editorial pages. So what can you do? What can we all do? The first thing is, when it comes up, make sure that political controversies, that you treat them as political controversies. Researchers that we've worked with who've done work on both evolution and on climate change in the classroom have suggested one strategy as if you know that this is a topic that's going to come up, it can be useful to actually bring in bring in a social studies teacher in high school, bring in a political scientist, or bring in someone from the theology program or from a religious studies program, and say, okay, today we're going to talk about these issues. If you have religious questions, talk about we've got a religious studies scholar here who can talk about those issues. If you have scientific questions, and just make a clean distinction there, so to clarify that, and then bring in issues of the nature of science and why is that not a scientific question? Why is this a scientific question and that one's not? Because that's, if people come out of a science class understanding what science is and how science works, and not understanding the Krebs cycle, I'm okay with that. That's a better outcome than the other way around, right? So having that conversation can be really valuable and diffuses these sorts of conflicts and helps students be better scientists and better scholars of science and better citizens down the road. Resist calls for false balance. Resist, if you're a science teacher or you're planning to become a science teacher, it's not uncommon for parents to come in and say, well, why don't you just teach both sides? Or they'll go to a principal, and the principal will come and say, well, why don't you teach both sides? And you can point to statements from the National Science Teachers Association that say it's not appropriate. You can point to statements from the National Educators Association, from the AAAS, National Academy of Sciences, from all these bodies that say it's not appropriate. It's a false balance. It's misleading the students. And you can always say, especially in journalistic contexts, people sometimes talk about these sorts of false balance things as opinions on the shape of the Earth differ. So it's always worth reminding people that, in fact, no, not in any relevant way. And then shift the conversation. If someone really says, well, you've got to, if you're a journalist, a lot of times the thing to do is, well, okay, evolution is not controversial, but within evolution there are legitimate controversies. Whether neutral mutations and neutral genetic drift dominates the evolutionary history of life, or whether natural selection and adaptive selection is a more important phenomenon. So having that be the controversy, talking about legitimate live scientific controversies, and migrating away from non-scientific, political, or religious controversies can be a way to diffuse that situation, to honor an editor's request that you get a contrary point of view, but still keeping within the realm of legitimate science. So with that, I'll put up our website again and take any questions. And can we turn the lights on again? Thanks.
I wanted to thank you both for really reminding us of science the process and distinguishing that for this audience. But I wanted to also say that science as an institution is also political. And it seems to me, and I work in public policy, that in some ways we're all caught in controversies arise because of certain expectations that we're all complicit in. And that science, the institution, not the practice, is in a kind of a bind because it does wish to help us to be a decision-making tool, to help us decide the kinds of things to base what we build, how we orient society around. And so then there's some expectations about what it can actually tell us that sometimes are disappointing. When in fact what you both revealed is that it's really an iterative model-making process that helps us understand the world. And so to some degree, I wonder if we keep that in mind, how we might reorient science communication and also the ways that we treat the institutions of science to emphasize this process of inquiry rather than making a hard distinction between what's science and what's not. I'm curious about that.
Certainly, if you look at political philosophy, whether it's Dewey or Rawls or Popper as he got into sort of open society things, was drawing on on that consensus-making process that science does very well, and that's central to how science works. And the idea of sort of, let's talk, Rawls talks about I'm forgetting the term that he uses, but sort of is it the public sphere? There's sort of, we all have our individual values and our own things, but what we talk about in the political context is our shared reality, somehow or other.
Yeah.
And that's what science gets at. There are other, it's not the only way that we necessarily get at our shared reality. There are things, sort of,
Other
we
ways
can
of
talk about,
talking.
but it certainly can root us in what we know. And even one thing that's important about science as a process, as this iterative process, is, I mentioned string theory and quantum gravity and all these things. Whatever happens with that, and I don't know because I'm not a physicist, whatever happens with that, it's got to explain everything that physics already explains. The basic, and for as crazy as relativity and everything was, the basic Newtonian mechanics still works. And I mean, the sort of
works with a slight adjustment that is usually irrelevant and is close to zero unless you're going close to the speed of light or near black holes.
And the astrology the astronomy that people came up with in a geocentric era is still what sailors use when they're doing astral navigation, right? Like it still works. It's just not as good. And if you need that extra precision, then you have to go to the next level. But whatever new comes along has to incorporate what was already there. And that's what lets you, and so as in policymaking, it's important to not just say, well, there's a controversy, so therefore let's pretend that, there are controversial issues within evolution, therefore let's pretend that the whole thing is a controversy. But to say, sure, there are some things that people are not agreeing on, but here's what everyone can agree on. And that's why things like the IPCC statements that you get around climate change can be really valuable for saying, well, here's where there's room for disagreement. But when they say that it's unequivocal that the Earth has gotten warmer over the last 150 years, it's unequivocal. Like there's not, the time for that debate is over. And the plausibility of anything new coming along when they say it's very likely that the warming is caused by humans, don't bet your house on it being the other way around, because there's a momentum there to what we've learned.